The views expressed, opinions given, and any communication made between the hosts and guests of What Are You Afraid of Horror and Paranormal Show do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Para X Radio, EMC Network, or all services that play this show. The hosts and services are not responsible for the actions of their guests, and the original rights of all intellectual property is retained by the creator, and all work is used with either permission or Creative Commons license. The show is for entertainment purposes only. I'm horror author T. Fox Dunham.
And I'm horror author and filmmaker Phil Thomas.
And tonight we're asking you,
what are you afraid of? Philadelphia's horror home with hosts T. Fox Dunham and Phil Thomas.
Episode 153, Opium, Absinthe, and Lydia Kang. Hello, Phil, how are you?
Oh, I'm just wonderful. How are you, Fox?
Hanging in there. We have a great guest on the show tonight, and someone that came to my attention a few months ago as we were getting in requests from media agents to come onto the show. So we're back to speaking to authors tonight, and I'm really looking forward to this. I know you are, Phil. I've been enjoying her book. In fact, I was almost late with the interview questions because I got into reading it more today, and I lost track of time. So that's always a good prop for a book. But
it sure is.
Yeah, so Lydia Kang is an author of an adult fiction and nonfiction, young adult fiction, poetry, including The Impossible Girl, A Beautiful Poison, Quackery, a Best Science Book of 2017 from NPR Science Friday, The November Girl 2017 winner of the Nebraska Book Award for Best Young Adult Fiction. She wrote Toxic in 2018, Catalyst in 2015, and Control Wow in 2013. She graduated from Columbia University and New York University School of Medicine, completing her residency and chief residency at Bellevue Hospital in New York City.
She's a practicing physician who has gained a reputation for helping fellow writers achieve medical accuracy in fiction. Her poetry and nonfiction have been published in JAMA, the Annuals of Internal Medicine, Canadian Medical Association Journal, Journal of General Internal Medicine, and Great Weather for Media. She believes in science and knocking on wood, and currently lives in Omaha with her husband and 3 children.
Hello, Lydia Kang. Welcome to What Are You Afraid of? How are you?
Hello, Fox, and hello, Phil. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Oh, our pleasure.
Absolutely.
We've been looking forward to this. In fact, Phil had even bought the book and said, I picked up this great new book for Halloween called Opium and Absinthe. And he's like, we should get her on the show. And I was like, Phil, the media agent? This is episode 153, Opium, Absinthe, and Dr. Lydia Kang. So you are a practicing doctor with an erudition of medical knowledge. You're a talented author who has written several popular books, and, from the looks of it especially, you are an amazing baker. On occasion, you even bind wishes to milkweed seeds and blow them off into the sky. When you were younger, did you want to be a doctor, or a baker, or an author, or a candlestick maker, or a creator of milkweed wishes? If you lived in an ideal world, like when you were younger, what would have been your primary profession?
Wow, that is a really good question. I don't know. It took me a really, really long time to come to the decision just to even consider writing as a profession. I kind of hit a dead end in 3rd grade when I tried to write this really, really dramatically sad novel about this child that died from leukemia, and the entire novel was all of like 3 sentences long, and I decided it was too hard to do. So at that point in time, I honestly didn't think I was capable of writing a book or imagining a book because it just wasn't there for me, interestingly enough. Becoming a physician, that didn't really happen until I was in college and volunteering in an emergency room. And I realized that I loved science and I liked helping people. And it was kind of the perfect profession for me. But as a child, I was really sort of all over the place. Like my favorite thing was to go rambling around in the woods with my friend and building forts out of like sticks and rocks and just pretending we were concocting weird brews out of weeds and things like that. So I don't know if that had any, it didn't give me any sort of idea that I'd be where it was, but I think my imagination was sort of free flowing then. And I think I tapped into that same kind of childhood imagination that I use now. But no, I really didn't know where I was going to be when I was a kid. I was all over the place.
I've been loving your book, Opium and Absinthe, and it's been a wonderful sort of follow-up to our Halloween reading. We had Dacre Stoker and, of course, Daniel Krauss with Vampire Zombies, and it's just a really interesting story, and I love your protagonist, Tilly. I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad you are enjoying it. It was kind of a mishmash of ideas, and I wasn't actually sure if I was going to be able to pull it off as I was writing it, but somehow it managed to weave itself together okay.
In your books, like, how much of yourself is in your heroes?
That is a good question. I think when I started writing, like my first couple novels, which never got published, like I put myself very deeply in those characters, because in the beginning, when you're starting out, you sort of write what you know. And so you kind of write from your own perspective a lot. So I actually strayed away from that a lot as the more I wrote. But interestingly, Tilly has a lot in common with me. We're both fairly curious. Like, Tilly has her version of sort of falling down the Wikipedia hole and like not emerging for hours at a time. And and we're kind of similar that way. I think like my entire family, we're the kind of people who like, we'll go on a walk and everybody's walking and we're all like off of the beaten path staring at this like butterfly that's like on the side of the road. We can't stop looking at and trying to identify and figuring out where it came from and what is it eating or what's it feeding. Like we'll just sort of, we tend to be really curious people that way when it comes to the natural world and liking to trying to find out answers to questions we have. And so Tilly has that curiosity that was really kind of near and dear to me. So I really sort of took that and I sort of pushed it to a place that was really not socially acceptable for her as a woman in 1899. So from that perspective, she was very similar to me. I have gotten questions about her opium addiction, whether or not I had any personal experience with that. And I said, well, first of all, that's a really personal question. And second of all, it turns out I do not. But as a physician, I've dealt with a lot of patients who have varying degrees of opioid addiction or dependence. And so that's been a really complicated aspect of medical care that all physicians have sort of had to deal with. And it's really changed over the course of the past 20 years that I've been practicing. It's changed quite a bit. So that was very close to me in that I was really aware of sort of how it could happen to people and how they go about it. And I really didn't want to vilify her as this terrible person who, has this dirty habit. I wanted people to understand that it is a disease and it could happen to anybody. And that she doesn't magically, it's not exactly something that you can just snap your fingers and suddenly be cured of. It stays with you sometimes forever. So Tilly, there were a lot of aspects of, I think, of my existence, of my life and my practice that kind of went into making her. And of course, there's this one scene where she's trying to write something for the first time and she has no idea what she's doing and she doesn't know how. And Ian gives her a little bit of advice that just says, you just have to try, there's a first time for everything and it's going to be difficult. I'm paraphrasing. That's probably not exactly what Ian says, but I sort of, that came from personal experiences as a writer about how difficult it is to face that blank page and knowing what you have to put on there and knowing it has to be a certain quality and be psyching yourself out and being just so nervous about that. So a lot of this came from personal experience for sure.
So you created this character, Matilda, Tilly, and she's very much the black sheep in her family. She's turned 18, and now's the time when, in her period, she should be looking for a husband, and she should be looking to settle down, give birth to several kids, and she should put away all these childish things like books and medicine and wanting to be a doctor or investigating her sister's death, which she believes could be vampires. This is in the first chapters of the book. And so it's a wonderful book. It's very dynamic. I really love Tilly a lot, and I can't wait to see what happens to her. So you write, you bake, you're a doctor, and I've worked with a lot of doctors over the years, and you know, every time I go for an appointment, they're always running behind. I get in to see them an hour later, or it takes them a few days to make a phone call back. They always seem to be incredibly busy, especially right now. So, and you're a parent too, which is just incredible. So, and I've seen your cake. I've seen the work you've done with your pastries. You really need to go on baking championship on Food Network, because you'd blow them all the way. We're going to set up a poll. Should Lydia Kang go on baking championship on Food Network? Her stuff, Phil, her stuff is remarkable. It looks so professional. She's perfect in everything she does. So you've got all these things going on. How do you allocate time for these passions of yours?
The baking thing is a relatively new thing. It's really kind of pandemic stress baking, to be honest. I'm really open to sort of exploring and cooking all different kinds of food and stuff like that. And, you know, some of my childhood memories from my favorite books are all the food scenes in books. So I just love the creation of food and the growing of food. I just think it's fascinating. And it's really soothing to me personally. So I try to make time for it. I always have a garden going every summer. I try to cook from it. And the baking thing has been happening basically on weekends. It is like my sort of, I block out this period of time where I do nothing but bake. And it's wonderful because I get to eat all the results of it. So it's very self-serving, and I have grown this enormous sweet tooth that I have to fill every week. So that's what I do. You know, as far as the writing and the doctor work, they work kind of in concert with each other. So I am a part-time physician. So a couple of days a week, I'm in the hospital, in the clinic, seeing patients, and the rest of my week, I'm at home writing or doing interviews, as the case may be. And they complement each other particularly well because they're incredibly distinct, different extremes of two different jobs. You know, one can be life and death, and one can be very imaginative. Others, like the doctor work, sometimes you're just loaded down with paperwork and busy work that can just be really frustrating sometimes. And in my writing work, I get to create worlds and kill off characters that I don't like, which I do not do. So I get a lot of my inability to control the real world just sort of gets taken care of in my creative life, and vice versa. When the world of publishing, as you guys know, can be really frustrating sometimes. And nothing's ever set in stone. There are no guarantees with whether or not people are going to like your books or buy your books, or if you're ever going to get a book contract. And sometimes those ups and downs are very well compensated by the fact that I can go to work and actually make somebody feel better when they feel sick. And that is really, really a sort of a reassuring thing that I have these two aspects of my life.
But we are speaking to Lydia Kang about her new book, Opium and Absinthe. It was just a wonderful story. Now, we have an excerpt from your book, and David Walton, our fantastic English folk singer, narrated this excerpt. We're going to play this now for our audience. This is episode 153, Opium, Absinthe, and Lydia Kang on What Are You Afraid Of? Horror and Paranormal Show. We're on Parax Radio Friday nights at 9 p.m. And check out our website at www.whatareyouafraidofpodcast.com for our archive of ghost stories, which is always increasing, articles, interviews, plus a page for every episode, all 153. This is an excerpt from Opium and Absinthe, read by David Walton on What Are You Afraid Of?
This is Katrina Weidman of Destination America.
This is Joe R. Lansdale, creator of the Hap and Leonard series.
This is actor and filmmaker Steve Monarch from Friday the 13th, the series.
This is Heather Taddy from Paranormal State and Alien Highway.
This is Chuck Zukowski from Travel Channel's show Alien Highway.
This is Dacre Stoker, great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker and author of Dracula.
This is Michelle Belanger from Portals to Hell.
And you are listening to Ghost Stories and Horror with T. Fox Dunham and Phil Thomas.
With the T. Fox Dunham and Phil Thomas.
Fox and Phil.
Billy and Fox.
What are you afraid of?
What are you afraid of?
What are you afraid of?
What are you afraid of? Horror and Paranormal Show.
What are you afraid of?
There'd be no Philadelphia without Uncle Lloyd.
An excerpt from the novel Opium and Absinthe written by Lydia Kang and read by David Walton. Chapter 5. Tilly took to her bed for the entire week, consumed by Dracula. She told everyone that it was her collarbone, that it ached something terrible, and that her despair over her sister's loss had driven her to bed. Too much pain and anguish for Tilly to tolerate being around anyone. This was only partially true. She saw ghosts of Lucy everywhere when she was awake. The quotidian activities of the house were warped versions of what they'd been before Lucy died. She now broke her fast every morning alone, when before Lucy used to ask Tilly over their breakfast tea, "Give me a word from your dictionary, Tilly, a new one I've never heard of. Astonish me." When Grandmama would catch them laughing as she walked by, she didn't eat breakfast as she thought it unwholesome for a woman of her age. She'd snap, "Matilda." There was always only one Pembroke lady at fault, and it never seemed to be Lucy. Perhaps now that Lucy had taken the unforgivable step of dying without Grandmama's permission, Tilly was becoming more tolerable in her eyes. Grandmama hadn't taken away her opium, for example. Not yet. Tilly asked for copies of the newspaper, but nothing more had been written about Lucy's death. Were the police investigating? She didn't know. Her family and the servants refused to say anything, worried it would hamper her healing and her delicate constitution. And so, between her wretched grief and her foggy hours under the spell of the opium drops, Tilly pulled a copy of Dracula from beneath her pillow and read, determined to learn anything that might tell her how Lucy had died. It was such an awful book. No lady of standing would be caught reading such a story. It was replete with visions that were wholly unchristian. But it had opened a world Tilly didn't know, and that was always heavenly. She wished the mysterious Carpathian mountains were yet undiscovered, and that she could search them herself. She thought of this monster, this Dracula, and despite her disgust, recognized how elegant and romantic he was. He was in love, and he was lonely. Tilly read on and off throughout the week. She scribbled down her questions in a tiny notebook she kept under her pillow, attached to a small pencil. Who was this author, this Mr. Stoker? Where did he live? Did any of these stories come from truth, or were they only dark children's fairy tales? At night she would place a blanket under the crack of her door, so no one suspected she was reading by lambent electric light. She's banished Ada from waking her up for medicine when she did slumber. In the morning, groggy and underslept, she would force herself to sit up when Ada brought her a supply of sweetened tea and fresh oatcakes speckled with raisins. Then she would quickly shoo Ada from the room after her ablutions were completed. By the time she had finished reading and rereading the book, her body felt wrung out and weary. This was only fiction. How could it make her feel this way? Tilly reread one passage in particular, as if trying to undo a puzzle within herself. It had been written by Jonathan Harker's character after he had become trapped inside Dracula's castle, left to the vices of the Count's vampire wives. In the moonlight opposite me were 3 young women, ladies by their dress and manner. All 3 had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing and at the same time some deadly fear. He is young and strong. There are kisses for all. The fair girl went on her knees and bent over me, fairly gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white, sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin and seemed about to fasten on my throat. Here, Tilly would shut the book, fling it away to the end of her bed, before reaching out and feverishly finding the passage to read it again. The bite. The bite did not happen in this passage, but it would soon. At the end of the week, Tilly pulled herself out of the bed and looked about. Her room was in disorder. Empty bottles of opium were scattered on a tray at the foot of her bed, alongside crumbs left over from 2 cakes she had eaten. Her damask bed linens were bunched on the floor, the matching drapery pulled shut. In the dim electric light, she looked at herself in the mirror. Her wrinkled nightgown was damp beneath her arms, and her left arm was still bandaged close to her chest. Tilly's dark hair tumbled down over her shoulders in frazzled waves. Purplish shadows haunted the hollows beneath her eyes. "I look like I belong in the book," she said aloud. Both Lucy's, hers and the one in the novel, had succumbed to vampires, but perhaps Tilly herself was more like Mina, Harker's wife. Dracula had fed Mina his own blood to effect her transformation into a vampire. Tilly opened her mouth wide and inspected her teeth. Her sharp canines seemed pitifully small and unanimal-like. How could a person bite someone with these? How could a vampire grow such teeth? The newspaper said no blood had been found at the scene, which meant even Lucy's lilac dress must have been spotless. How? Tilly crawled across the bed, grabbed her small notebook and scribbled on a new page. No blood at scene. How to drink blood without making a mess. She put the notebook down and went back to her mirror. With her free hand, she yanked at the side of her mouth to gain a better view of her left canine. "Definitely not sharp enough," she said, saliva pooling under her tongue. Though with her fingers in her mouth, it sounded like, "Definitely not sharp enough." The door swung open suddenly, and her mother entered the room. Tilly's eyes opened wide, and she quickly pulled her fingers away, a rope of saliva linking her fingertip to her chin. "Matilda, what are you doing?" her mother asked.
Illuminating the paranormal. Opening your mind to the possibility. We'll talk about all things metaphysical, paranormal, and everything in between. Illuminating the Paranormal, Tuesday nights from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern on Para X.
We are back on episode 153, Opium, Absinthe, and Lydia Kang. We are speaking to the very talented Lydia Kang. So the book, Opium and Absinthe, the back reads, New York City, 1899. Tilly Benbrook's sister lies dead, her body drained of blood, and with 2 puncture wounds on her neck. Bram Stoker's new novel, Dracula, has just been published, and Tilly's imagination leaps to the impossible. The murderer is a vampire. But it can't be, can it? A ravenous reader and researcher, Tilly has something of an addiction to truth, and she won't rest until she unravels the mystery of her sister's death. Unfortunately, Tilly is addicted to more than just truth. To erase the pain from a recent injury, she's taking more and more laudanum, and some in her immediate circle are happy to keep her well supplied.
Tilly can't bring herself to believe vampires exist, but with the hysteria surrounding her sister's death, the continued vampiric slayings and the opium swirling through her body, it's becoming increasingly difficult for a girl who relies on facts and figures to know what's real, or whether she can trust those closest to her. Some of your books are set in the American Industrial Age. It's a time of robbers, barons, enthusiastic expansion, and the impoverished class living in filthy conditions. How do you research your settings?
So far, all the historical novels that I've written, so A Beautiful Poison, The Impossible Girl, and Opium and Absinthe, they all take place in New York City, where I lived for about 16 years after growing up in Baltimore, Maryland. So New York is really close to me as far as, the layout of it is very familiar to me because I lived there for so long. From that perspective, it was easy for me to be able to do some of my research because I could more easily visualize past time periods because I sort of had a grounding of where I was. I have used a lot of different resources to do my research. So I try to find an accurate map of the year that my book takes place in. And I study the map pretty carefully and I go back to it so that I can orient myself. Other things that I do is I will read books that were released around that time just so that I can get more comfortable with the language because people talked differently, like quite differently. Their idioms were different, all that sort of thing. I do research on what they wore, how they traveled, how much things costed back then, all sorts of things. Anytime there was a funeral, I would have to do all this research on, well, what was a typical funeral during Victorian times or, at the turn of the century, during the Gilded Age, that sort of a thing. So it's a huge mishmash of many, many different materials and sources that sort of come together. And it's kind of a painstaking process. It makes writing a lot longer and harder. It's pretty easy to get lost in a single moment where somebody's like stepping into a horse carriage and you have to know what it's called, or if there's a step, or if there's a handle, and how many people can it seat, and what does the street look like? Is it full of like horse manure, or is this a cleaner part of town? Are they laying asphalt down? Yeah, I mean, it gets pretty overwhelming sometimes. So I do a chunk of research before I even write anything on the page. I do a chunk of research in order to create my plot because some plot things can't actually happen unless the period of time supports it. And then I sort of go back and I fill in a lot of the things that are missing to keep it accurate, but without bogging it down. I'm not. I always worry about putting the right balance of historical aspects into my book so that it keeps it accurate without bogging it down. So that's always a bit of a struggle.
I built an incredible library for historic research, and it's something that you have to read and enjoy and eat this material for years before you can accurately write historic fiction. I've read Civil War stories that have been published where it's like, oh, the Confederates and the North, and that's all you ever hear of it in a Civil War setting. It could be said at any time. And people are always like, we've got all these books, you must have everything you need. I'm like, well, I've got plenty of names and dates and when it happened, but very few books on the flavor of the gum a German soldier, a soldat would chew in World War II. In another interview for your book, Toxic, you talked about writing science fiction. Opium and Absinthe reads more like an historical detective novel, but Control is the story of a society focused on pure DNA and the elimination of the genetically enhanced. So you're in all these genres. In fact, I read that, I'm like, she would love Greg Bear's Darwin's Radio, which was about a retrovirus that initiated a major evolutionary change in the human species within a generation. We spoke to Greg over the summer. He's wonderful. So do you have a preferred genre, or do you love all your genre children equally?
I'm sort of my agent's worst nightmare because I cannot stick to one thing. People are always, when I started in the publishing business, people are like, oh, you have to have your you got to have your shtick. Like, you got to have, like, this is your brand. And my brand is going to be, when I first started writing, it was young adult science fiction. And so there was a sort of like, this onus on me to sort of only produce, young adult science fiction. Well, of course, that wasn't selling very well. Around 2014 to 2016, like the dystopian young adult fiction world just kind of came crashing down. It just wasn't making as much money and people weren't buying those books. And so whatever was my brand was just like out the window because I couldn't sell that. I just kept falling in love with stories, and the stories would sometimes be science fiction. Sometimes they would be historical. Sometimes they were contemporary. I never really know what's going to strike me, but when it does, it hits pretty hard. And unfortunately, I tend to genre hop a lot because of it. So, yeah, I'm all over the place. And it is, I'm just one of those people who, if you just look at my books, it's just, you sort of wonder, like, what's next? Like, where is this going? Because it's all over the place. I can't really help what story I'm going to fall in love with. It sort of happens. And when that does happen, it usually means that I can write a book that I really am passionate about. If I was the kind of person who had to write nothing but historical fiction for the rest of my life, I don't think I'd be very happy because I'd feel really penned in. So I will not probably be writing nothing but historical fiction forever. For my historical fiction fans, I apologize for that in advance. But I can't help it. But there are some common themes in my books. They're usually kind of quirky, and they're a little bit weird and a bit bizarre. And I guess that's the one thing that is the common thread in them, is that I fall in love with some really weird ideas and I just kind of go with them. So
here's a story for you and Phil it's actually kind of fun. When I was selling, in my early days, when I was trying to break into professional writing, and it was horror that I seemed to sell the most of, so I sort of joined up into horror fiction and built my reputation there. But I was also writing science fiction, fantasy literature, but I was also writing some erotica to see what would happen. Very nice erotica. And probably you could go into a bookstore like Barnes & Noble at any one time, and my book about Andy Kaufman could be on the shelf, or Mercy could be on the shelf, but most likely they aren't, because too many popular authors from the last 300 years limit space on the bookshelf. But you could go into every Barnes & Noble. In fact, you still can right now go to a Barnes & Noble down the street from you, go into the anthology section, and you will find a book called The Big Book of Orgasms. and you turn to page like 30, and there I am. At every Barnes & Noble around the world, you will find The Big Book of Orgasms. The staff at that one Barnes & Noble didn't know about it, because I was over there with Bill a lot, like every day, working out of there, getting out of the house when I felt well enough. And then one day, apparently someone told them, because I walked in, went up to the counter, ordered my coffee, my latte, and the girl behind the counter walks up and she says, "By the way, Fox, really great porn."
Oh, God.
Oh my God.
I was like, thank you.
Like, it's not porn, it's erotica.
Yeah,
Get it right. Anyway, so Lydia, how did you create Tilly Pembroke? From what sources was she drawn?
I think I knew at some point in time that I was going to bring in Nellie Bly into the story, who's one of the most famous female journalists in history. And so I had to know, I knew that she was at some point in time going to sort of cross paths with her, and I had to figure out, well, what kind of person would put themselves in a situation where they might be writing an article when they'd never written one before, and how would a person deal with a sister's death, and what would actually drive them to actually do an investigation when at that point in time most people would just sort of leave it be and let the police do what they needed to do and not get involved, because that's a messy, dirty thing for an upper crust lady to take care of. And so knowing sort of where she had to go, I had to sort of construct her character from that. And again, I really did pull a lot from my own personal kind of experience of being just a really curious person, and always wanting to sort of find out the whys. Like, when there's like a little kid who's sort of constantly asking, why is the sky blue? Why are the trees green? Because there's chlorophyll. Well, what's chlorophyll? Well, it's just, but how does it get there? And like, why did so Tilly was that kid that never really grew out of the question asking. So that's sort of how she came to be.
Interesting.
We're talking to the incredible Lydia Kang on episode 153 of What Are You Afraid of? Horror and Paranormal Show. Yes, we go on, not just at Halloween time. We do about 2 episodes a month, and we've actually got some wonderful people lined up for the next couple of months. People who contacted me around Halloween, so we're going to provide some fantastic stories to our listeners. And find our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com, where you can find more information about Lydia, how to get her book, plus information about the other guests we've had on, new interviews, articles, my recipes, my gumbo recipes, editing my first anthology as an editor, coming through in waves, a charity anthology for the Lymphoma and Leukemia Society, and that
cool.
I will never do this again. I will never do this again.
Lydia, you mentioned that you've never had a paranormal experience, but you did have a graveyard story. We would very much love to hear that.
Sure. So when I was a debut author, my book was coming out, it was like in 2013. I was invited on this blog for book readers and stuff, and they said, okay, we have a challenge for you. We want you to, and I think it was in the fall, so it was like Halloween time, and they said, we challenge you to go to a cemetery when the sun is setting, see what happens. And it was, and I was like, what? I'm a grown woman. You want me to do what? I can't do that. And I was a little scared. I don't naturally seek out cemeteries. I was one of those kids where when you drove past one, you're supposed to hold your breath, right, or else the spirits get in you and who knows what happens and that sort of thing. And so I was really, my initial thought was, I'm not going to do this. There's no way. And then the second thought was, what are you really afraid of? You should just go do this and it'll be an interesting challenge. And so I did a little research. There was a cemetery that I used to drive by on the way to work all the time. And it's called the Bohemian Cemetery in Omaha. And it was sort of founded by Czech immigrants. So I would drive by it all the time, and I was like, Bohemian Cemetery, that sounds interesting. And I decided to pick it for my cemetery, and I found that it was open to a certain amount of time. So I wasn't going to be like breaking and entering or anything like that. So I went there, and the sun was just starting to set, and it was shockingly serene and beautiful, and not nearly as frightening as I thought it was going to be. But I was still scared. Like I'm in the business in my profession of trying to keep people alive. I don't generally hang out with them after the fact. So right. It was really uncomfortable for me to do that, to walk around a cemetery and to acknowledge that I was surrounded by people who had lived their lives for short or for long, and now were resting here. And I was really nervous about making sure I wasn't going to, I didn't want to step on any graves. I didn't want to, I felt like I was in a room full of strangers and they were all watching me. That is kind of what it felt like. And so I was really shockingly nervous about it. Not fearful for my life or anything. And so finally I found a little place to sit down. The sun was starting to set. And I think part of the dare was go write some poetry in a cemetery. And so I had a journal with me. I opened it up, and as soon as I sat down on this little patch of grass between some headstones, there was a little patch of clover. And I have this habit of every time I see clover, I just look at it. I give it a sort of extra glance to see if there are any 4-leaf clovers. And I find them all the time. I find them in my yard. I found them throughout my childhood. My husband has never found a single one, which is interesting. He's sort of shocked. He's like, I don't understand how you could have found so many in your life, and I found 0. I'm like, well, I don't know, but I have. And so I sat down, there's a patch of clover in front of me, and lo and behold, there was this 4-leaf clover just sitting right in front of me. And I felt like it was some sort of a sign. I don't know. I'm a very scientific person. And so, I don't technically believe in signs or anything, but here was this 4-leaf clover sitting down when I just gave it a second glance, and I wrote a couple of poems, and I just felt very welcomed there. I felt this overwhelming sense that that the souls in these graves, wherever they were, if they existed, were lonely, and they appreciated my presence. So this is this is well beyond the sort of normal kind of behavior that I have or thoughts that I have as far as, I can be a romantic, and I can be pretty imaginative about certain things, but day-to-day stuff, I'm pretty concrete about things. So it was a really unusual experience for me. And when the sun finally set and it started to get dark again, I didn't feel any sense of danger. I just felt very welcomed. And it got kind of cold, and I finally got up. I'd written my poems. I thanked them for letting me stay with them, and I went home. And it was actually this amazing experience, but it's not at all what I expected whatsoever. And it wasn't scary. It wasn't actually scary. I know you guys are looking for a scary story.
No, it doesn't matter.
It wasn't at all.
Yeah. A lot of our ghost stories aren't scary. They're just stories like stories of family coming back or animals coming back. And a lot of our ghost stories end up being family members who make contact after they die. That's one of the categories I have up on our ghost story archive, where I've actually just did a lot of work on the website, so you can go over the Ghost Story Archive, and every story has a little synopsis and a picture button you can hit on your phone, and you can either read it or listen to one of our voice actors record it. We've done about 250 stories at this point. I'm still adding them up all the time. I also find graveyards very, very reassuring. So this is episode 153, Opium, Absinthe, and Lydia Kang, author of the wonderful book. We're going to go on break in just a moment, but two things I wanted to mention, Phil, is that Spell, that motion picture by Paramount Pictures, is now premiering at home, and you don't want to miss the terrifying suspense thriller Spell, starring Omar Hardwick from the TV show Power and the Red Divine. Marquis, it's a cool movie played by Omar Hardwick, awakens from a plane crash, right, like in the South. And he's imprisoned by a mysterious woman practicing hoodoo magic. It's very much like anything from Misery. He figures out he's a prisoner, and he's subject to this very different life. He's from New York. He wears a suit, and he's trying to break free of this woman because his family is going to become subjected to these sinister rituals. And go check that out. We got codes for that. If anybody wants to review for that, free codes from Paramount Pictures. But you can buy or rent Spell today on digital. It's rated R from Paramount Pictures. You can find links up to Spell on our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com. The other thing I wanted to mention was Nightside, Tales of Outer Noir is now available.
Yeah. I actually just got a copy.
Did you? You got your copy?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
You have a story in that? And I've got a story.
I do have. You have a story in that. Teddy Bear Kill Kill.
Yes. and mine is about...
which is a takeoff of Pussycat Kill Kill. Or Faster Pussycat Kill Kill. And what was yours called?
I don't inspire that kind of love in a man. And it's all about a woman who believes her husband is cheating on her because he's happy. And she's a miserable person, and she's made him miserable his whole life. And so now he's suddenly happy every night, so she figures he's cheating on her. Has to be, because she's not the kind of woman that inspires love and happiness in a man. But then she finds out their marriage is actually great now, because there's a secret she doesn't know about. So that's in the story there from Nightside, Tales of Outer Noir. You'll find a link to get the book over at our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com. That's Mark Slade. He's an old friend, and he's just one of those pulp writers. And Kim Goodwin has a story in that. She's kind of coming up in writing, and she has a story in my anthology, Coming Through in Waves, the Pink Floyd inspirational crime novel anthology, and that'll be out probably in a month from now. We're setting the time with the editor. But we will be right back on episode 153, Absinthe, Opium, and Lydia, on What Are You Afraid of? Horror and Paranormal Show on Parex Radio, Friday nights at 9 p.m. Again, check out our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com for more information on Lydia, how to find her website, how to get her book. Go look at my gumbo recipe, which is just incredible, plus my cheesecake pumpkin pie recipe. Plus we have articles, our archive of ghost stories, interviews, some articles on how to write. And we have a new subscription page. You can find us and subscribe us on all the major podcast services, from iHeartRadio to Player FM to Apple Music. It's all there. We've been doing this 5 years. Had a great Halloween, and we will be right back with Lydia Kang.
Red, where are you going?
I'm going back to the paranormal view, back where I belong.
Please, take me with you.
No, I'm through with everything here. I want to see if there's something left in life I haven't explored. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, Red, don't run to them. They talk about ghosts and hauntings, UFOs, and all kind of supernatural scary stuff.
You'll never understand, will you, Scarlet?
No!
Well, that's your misfortune.
Rat! 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 Rat, if you go, where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear... Line!
Oh, you gotta be kidding.
That's The Paranormal View with your host, Henry Foister, Jeffrey Gould, and Barbara Duncan. Every Saturday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the Para X Radio Network.
Hello, folks. I've uploaded a compilation of 10 songs with a ghostly theme that have been specifically recorded for various episodes of What Are You Afraid Of podcast.com. Go to Bandcamp and search for Brendan Shawland. The album is called The Ghostly Brendan Shawland. You can listen to them for free or download them for a modest fee as a complete album or as individual songs. Thank you.
We are back with Lydia Kang on episode 153. You open your book with the line, "Better to be a coward than a corpse," and that becomes her mantra. This sounds like an important foundation theme for Opium and Absinthe. Could you tell us more about the other themes represented in the book?
Sure. So it's funny, that particular quote I actually lifted from that scene that I was writing at the time. You know, Tilly is riding side saddle, and I knew nothing about riding side saddle. So I had to go look up, you know, how to do this properly and what all the equipment was called and that sort of a thing from people who were riding at the turn of the century. And I found this wonderful historical book that was a sort of a compendium on how to ride properly. And that was in the book. It's better to be a coward than a corpse. And they were specifically talking about, you know, if you're on a horse and there's a jump coming and you don't think you're going to make it, don't do it, because you'd rather be alive than dead, and feel like, okay, I didn't do this beautiful, you know, wonderful jump, but at the same time, my neck is not broken. So I lifted that directly from that, and it turned out to be a really fantastic theme for the book about, you know, really conquering fear and what do you do to, you know, how much would you do to risk your life to find the truth, to really champion the truth. So that was one of the themes. And I think another theme is also, you know, the entire concept of a vampire story. And, you know, as a physician, is crossing that barrier of breaking skin. Anytime that we cut ourselves or we bleed, it's a small deal, it's a big deal, but it is changing or altering that which is whole. And it is a good sort of representative example of, you know, autonomy and health, innocence, and so many different things. And so, you know, the idea of her sister having these puncture wounds and her life is taken, but, you know, it's not just her life, it's everything that was slowly being taken away from, you know, her sister, as we learn in the book. That was one of the themes. And then, you know, when Tilly crosses over from becoming a laudanum addict to a morphine addict, in which she actually needed to inject morphine using a hypodermic syringe, you know, she makes note of that one moment where she's like, everything is going to change after, like, you know, after this needle, you know, punctures that plane of skin, like I will have crossed into a place that I've never been into. And there's that sense of foreboding and that sense of like, do you really, really want to do this? So that was another sort of theme in the book. You know, this sort of, you know, this rendering of the whole of the self. And also there's also just the sort of what is real, what is unreal. And so that was also a lot of fun to play with. So there's several different themes. Absinthe was a theme as well. I'm kind of fascinated by absinthe, even though I don't love the drink itself. But I love the ritual of it. I think it is absolutely fascinating and very cool. And I'm going to probably try, I'm going to have to play around with some absinthe cocktails and find like just the right one. But yeah, so there were a lot of different things, you know, I kind of played around with and explored throughout the book in several different themes.
People who pour absinthe over sugar cubes and drink it that way. It's a beautiful green liquid made partly from wormwood. I wanted to mention your theme of puncturing the skin. That's very much one of the themes of my medical horror hospital book, Mercy, which was very much a catharsis from the treatment that I felt getting chemotherapy and radiation and being in the hospital, because, when you break the skin or you subject yourself to some kind of pain, you know in your mind that the doctor is doing it to help you, but there are certain raw instincts deep in the brain that go, no, don't puncture the skin. No, don't let them do this to you. No, don't let them cause pain.
Yes, absolutely.
You actually develop a sense that you betrayed yourself.
Well, Lydia, you wrote a book, a nonfiction book called Quackery, A Brief History of the Worst Ways to Cure Everything. And I'm just curious, what would be your top 2 or 3 absolute outlandish ways that people treated certain conditions that you could come to mind?
Fantastic.
Oh, gosh. One would be cannibalism. So I'm not talking about eating your fingernails. That's not the same thing.
Right.
Like actually consuming parts of another human being that unwillingly gave their life or, didn't voluntarily give their body part to be consumed, like, eating someone else's blood or liver or that sort of a thing. The consuming of other humans for medical reasons has been done for hundreds of years. And it is as skin crawling as you think it is in many cases, unfortunately.
It sounds
so that would be, it was. And there was a huge trade in mummies for a while, Egyptian mummies that would be stolen out of tombs in Egypt, and then they would be dried and ground up and used as medication. I'm sure the mummies did not expect that was going to happen to them. They needed that body to make it into the next world, so that was not good for them. The other thing would probably be, so that's definitely one of my favorites. Oh, and mercury is probably another one, just because historically mercury is so interesting. Yeah, quicksilver.
Calomels.
Water silver, calomel, exactly. Mercuric chloride. That's mercurous chloride, excuse me. Mercuric chloride is something else. So yeah, mercury was used for so many different things. And
syphilis.
Yes, it was a huge syphilis treatment. Probably didn't work. They would take it to the point where they were causing themselves, mercury poisoning. And so they were salivating pints and pints of saliva, and, they would get these ulcerations in their mouth from like having too much saliva, and it would cause them to have these like horrible, like black diarrhea. It was just awful, awful stuff. And, but mercury is just a fascinating element in general. I don't know if you guys are of the right age, if you were kids of the 70s or so. But like, I played with mercury with like broken thermometers when I was a kid.
I did the same,
Yeah, it's just a really cool. It's the only metal that's liquid at room temperature, and it was in thermometers. It was like it's just really cool. Except it was not cool the way it was used in history. But that was the first chapter that I wrote for this book. So it's very kind of near and dear to my heart, just because I learned so much about mercury and the usage of mercury throughout time, and it's awesome. It's a very neat chapter.
I remember in 5th grade or so, in science class, I wasn't playing with mercury, but they put it in a bowl and they let us like poke at it with sticks and just, they said they warned us not to touch it, but it never happened today. I mean, they wouldn't even get it close to us like that, any sticks like that. We never touched it. They warned us, do not touch it because you can get mercury poisoning. But to even subject us, when you think about it, is just crazy. This is the 80s, so yeah.
Yeah.
When I worked at the various museums, I took up a specialty. Part of me was always in the garden, doing garden work and working with herbalists. And the other part of me was studying medical history. So the reasons I knew it would click pretty well. And my period of focus was 1701 medicine, which was still using humoral theory, which were the 4 humors that were out of balance in the body, but things like blistering, calomels, bloodletting, that sort of thing, which was popular up until the Civil War. And I used to have the kids, they used to bring in classrooms to the museum. We'd all have our different stations, and mine was medical history, and it's the grossest thing in a museum that you can do. So the kids would go to school the next day and write letters back to us, and I always got these stack of letters like, my brother broke his leg, would you have sawed it off back in the time when William Penn lived? And things like that, and talking about
only if it was gangrenous.
Right.
Oh, Fox, I have to get you a copy of this book because I've got all of that in here.
I can't wait to read it. I'll get a copy on my Kindle and read it.
So I wrote half the book, and my friend Nate Peterson wrote the other half, so we co-wrote it together. Quackery was the reason why Opium and Absinthe happened. My research, because I did the entire chapter on opium, this is where I found out exactly when morphine was starting to get used, when syringes were invented, and I found out from doing my research that the first people who had morphine addictions from injectable morphine were oftentimes these very wealthy women, because the syringes were these really expensive hand-blown glass metal kits, and only the rich people could afford them. And of course, women who were having all sorts of symptoms for a variety of reasons, they were saying that they were hysterical and they had hysteria. And so they would be, so they would be treated with injectable morphine to calm them down, and they became morphine addicts. And so I thought, I bet a lot of people don't realize that wealthy white ladies were like some of the first like injectable opiate addicts in the Western Hemisphere. And so I thought, well, let's do that to Tilly. Let's be kind of mean. So it was a fascinating sort of period of time to explore from a medical standpoint. So that's sort of where the inspiration for Opium and Absinthe came from.
The term hysteria being very much a misogynistic term, meant to be a special kind of craziness. A woman gets like hysteria, hysterectomy. And I've read in medical journals there were two conditions that they would treat, like she's talking about. It would either be a woman who had that special case of hysteria that needed to be calmed down. They would let her blood until she calmed down. Or the other thing was sexual hysteria. If a woman showed any kind of libido, they would try to treat it with chemicals or electroshock or things like that.
Well, did you guys ever see that film? It's called Hysteria. It's about that. It's with Maggie Gyllenhaal. Yeah,
that movie is hilarious.
You've seen it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And it's based on the true history of treating women with quote unquote hysteria with the first electrical.
At the end they had the first vibrator.
Yeah, they did.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So yes, and we talk about that as well in the book, because hysteria was this idea that you had this wandering womb that was causing mischief, and you could lure it back down to where it belonged if you put like fresh smelling herbs between a woman's legs, or if they were misbehaving, again, you could bleed them and do these other things. But it was this concept that like the womb, that's what hysterectomy comes from. I can't remember if it's Latin or Greek. It comes from the uterus was just, it wasn't being pinned down correctly. And the only way to keep it under good control was to be married and having sex regularly with a husband. So it was just this really interesting, very misogynistic concept that pervaded, Victorian times. And that's in the book too. So
that's
wonderful.
I can't wait to read all these. She's definitely
I'm looking forward to reading this. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you guys might find some good fodder for your next book in here, because it is, some of the stuff in here is absolutely bananas. Let me just tell you that right now. We wrote it specifically to be funny. So it is humorous. And I apologize ahead of time. I tell people, I'm like, the book is written with like the sort of humor of like a 14-year-old boy. So it's not terribly dry. Let's just put it that way.
That's funny though. You got to interject humor with some of this stuff. It's because it's such a serious subject that the humor kind of balances it out, I think, and that's wonderful.
Yeah,
that's wonderful. I'm looking forward to reading that. Now we ask a lot of our writers that are on here, what their writing process is. So we like to ask you, what is your writing process like from idea to finished book?
So usually I get this flash of an idea. So like, again, for Opium and Absinthe, it was this historical tidbit that I was like, oh, a woman in the late 1800s who has surprising morphine addiction. When I realized I was going to have the book take place around that time, I was like, all right, it's going to be a murder mystery. I just don't know who's going to be murdered yet. And I started looking around, well, what time period? Because like I had mentioned before, I can't actually write a book that's historical fiction without really pinning down exactly what year I'm going to be in, so that I can know historically what happens in that year. Is that going to work with my plot? Is it going to be okay? And one of my kids is super into musicals and was listening to all these musical soundtracks and kept listening to the Newsies, which is a musical about the Newsies strike that happened in 1899, when these big newspaper companies were suddenly saying like, oh, we're not going to pay you back for the newspapers that you don't sell, or not at the price that you should be getting. And so they had a huge strike. So I started looking that up, and it happened in 1899 in New York. And I'm like, okay, perfect timing and perfect place. And then I said, well, let me just see what else is going on in 1899. And I'm looking through this huge list of like all the different events that happened during the year, because they're all Googleable. Somewhere right on that list is Bram Stoker's Dracula is released in the United States in 1899. And the second I read that, I was like, it's going to be a vampire slaying. And that's how it all came together. So I said, I'm going to have Newsies. I'm going to have vampire slayings. Bram Stoker's Dracula is going to be woven throughout. She's going to be an opium addict. I got to make sure I do that well and do it right. And then along the way, probably happened halfway through my writing, that I realized I was going to bring Nellie Bly into the story too. So that's how it happened. A lot of different things in there.
That's incredible.
As we're closing down this episode 153, speaking to Lydia Kang.
We are closing the interview down. We are winding down. Is there anything cool happening that you'd like to tell us about? What's next for you? With any projects coming up?
Let's see. I am in the process of writing a World War II novel that is, again, another historical. It's going to be sort of part of this kind of quadrilogy of books that take place in New York. But that probably won't be coming out until like 2022. I am writing a follow-up book to Quackery with Nate Peterson that's called Patient Zero, and it is going to be about pandemics and the science behind pandemic. But the thing that's coming up the soonest is the anthology for The Empire Strikes Back. Is actually, the release is happening fairly soon. So it's called Star Wars from a Certain Point of View. So I wrote a short story from the perspective of 21B, who is the medical droid that you see at the end of the movie. So I hope you guys, check it out. All the proceeds, none of us authors have gotten paid for this. All the proceeds go to a charity. So it's all for a good cause. So you guys can check it out.
I'll make sure we'll links up for that at the website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com. Lydia, it's been fantastic speaking to you, and I'm sure we'll be communicating again in the future, and our audiences must have loved this episode. I'm so glad we did it this way too. Well, Lydia, it's been incredible speaking to you. This is episode 153 of What Are You Afraid of Horror and Paranormal Show, Opium, Absinthe, and Lydia Kang.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really great to learn more about you guys, and I had so much fun. Thanks a lot.
This is T. Fox Dunham.
And Mrs. Phil Thomas.
I'm in the business, in my profession, of trying to keep people alive. I don't generally hang out with them after.
T. Fox Dunham lives in Philadelphia with his wife, Allison. He's a lymphoma survivor, cancer patient, modern bard and historian. His first book, The Street Martyr, was published by Gutter Books. A television series based on the book is being produced by Throughline Films. Destroying the Tangible Illusion of Reality or Searching for Andy Kaufman, a book about what it's like to be dying of cancer, was released from Perpetual Motion Machine Publishing, and Fox is a story in the Stargate anthology Points of Origin from MGM and Fandemonium Books. Fox is an active member of the Horror Writers Association, and he's had published hundreds of short stories and articles. His motto is Wrecking Civilization, one story at a time. Find out more information at www.tfoxdunham.com.
Phil Thomas is an author and screenwriter from the suburbs of Philadelphia. His screenplays have been produced into 2 feature films, False Face and Always from Darkness, and are available in major retailers such as Best Buy and Target, as well as availability on Netflix and Amazon Prime on demand. His screenplay, 3 Tunnels, was a semi-finalist at the LA Screenplay Competition. He is a member of the International Association of Professional Writers and Editors, and he currently writes for Cultured Vultures, Game Skinny, and BloodyDisgusting.com. He formerly held the position of Senior Marketing Manager at Eternal Press, and was a journalist for Patch, where he wrote a daily tech column covering the latest electronics and gadgets. He lives in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and is currently working on his second novel, Worst Afterlife Ever.
The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.